the current system that it is ineffective, illogical, and inhumane. And so I think if we think about those three things, it's ineffective, it's illogical, and it's inhumane. If I can tell maybe just a personal little
Please.
anecdote here. When I was in youth group in my Southern Baptist church in not quite rural Southern Oklahoma growing up, that was one of the places where I heard the phrase the most, they should just go home. Now, this is in the 90s. Of course, I took this very personally. As I mentioned, I'm half Hispanic. My family is Mexican American. And this was directed toward me, toward my family, toward my neighbors, toward my peers and loved ones. And it was, they should just go home.
Hi there. Welcome to another episode of the Faithful Politics Podcast. To our viewers and our listeners, guys, thanks for joining us. I am your faithful host, Josh Bertram. And guys, make sure that you are liking, subscribing, doing the things that's hacking the algorithm and getting other people to get this good content, because we love getting you guys great content that's thought-provoking that you can share with others. Thanks for joining us. And today we are excited, I am excited, to be able to have on the show Alexis Busetti. She has her MHR and MDiv, and she's currently pursuing a PhD in intercultural studies at Fuller Theological Seminary. She hosts the That Makes Total Sense podcast and is committed to journeying toward the heart of God, exploring his generosity and justice, seeking out how to live it out every single day. She lives in Houston with her family, and we're so happy to be able to have her on the podcast today to talk about the latest book that she has written called Migration. This is a 6-week study and look at the Bible and what it says about migrants. Alexis, thank you so much for joining the podcast today and spending some time with us.
Josh, I am so thrilled to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Absolutely. So I got to just dive right in and ask you, why did you write a 6-week Bible study about migrants? What is your connection there, and why did you feel inspired to do it?
Yeah, this is one of those that I wish this was like, oh, I had some like incredible insight into, what the church was going to be dealing with in 2025 and all of this. And it is really just not the case. Several years ago, I was asked by an organization called Made for PACs to come on and help them with some organizing some of the content that they had. They are an organization that really ministers, and I would say, and by young BIPOC Christians. I am BIPOC, but I don't feel that young. And so when they asked me to come on and help them with some of this was one of the topics where they had already curated beautiful, to use the word in your podcast, faithful, just thoughtful content surrounding the topic of migration. My family is, my dad's side has their own migration stories that look probably similar to other white Americans, where they came from Europe several generations ago. And my mother's side is Mexican American. And that is where my migration story feels the closest to home, even though I am a few generations removed in the U.S., and I'm sure we'll talk about this some today. Those of us who are brown or otherwise kind of singled out for being, our migration stories are singled out, I would say, differently than those who look like my dad or even my husband. And so even though I do not have a migration story that looks like my great-grandmother's, this still really resonated with me. And so I'm just grateful to have been a part. This is many, many, many contributors to this study, and I'm just grateful to have been a part of them.
That's really awesome. So I love that. I love the connection with your past. I guess in one sense, we're all migrants, right? I was listening to this, I was listening to a lecture series. It's a course on the Great Courses. I talk about them all the time. We are not sponsored by the Great Courses in any way. I just really love their stuff. And so I I listened to a lot of their lectures, and this one was on kind of like the origins of humanity, and it has a particular viewpoint, but what it talks about is that, they didn't find, they haven't found any of the different kinds of like Homo sapien and different within that kind of I don't know if it's the genus or whatever, the Homo, that like Erectus and all these different. I'm forgetting them now, and I'm going to try to remember them, and it's going to be awkward, so I'm not going to do that. But essentially, all those old humans, right? Different kinds of humans. They haven't found any skeletons, at least at the time of the recording, in the course recording. They hadn't found any in the like United States area or in North America, South America. So they're like, hey, people came over this land bridge between Siberia and Russia, like, I don't know, 20,000 years ago, 40, 30, what, something like that. And they migrated from there to North America and then into South America because of climate change, essentially is what they're saying. That's the theory. And so it's like, man, we're all migrants at some point, and all of us have had to, in our past, we could probably, if we thought about it enough, make that connection. I would love to start with like just a sense of, if we're defining a migrant, what is a migrant? Just to get really clear on definitions, to get clear on even definitions of migration and migrant. I mean, I hear that. I have assumptions about what that means. But for the purpose of the book, what you're doing, and for this podcast, what's that nuanced definition of migrant that you guys are offering?
Yeah, so I don't have a terribly nuanced definition. I think it'd be good for us to think about migrant, maybe even slightly separated from immigrant, because that is a
Mm,
really politically charged word right now. But if we just think about
it is.
migration, I think we really can think about that in terms of anyone who is on the move. So if we think about this biblically, I would say we can look at this like Jesus is a really great example of two different kinds of migration. So in his toddlerhood, the Gospels tell us that he
Yes.
moved, that he migrated from where his family was living into a neighboring country because of fear of persecution. If we were to anachronistically name Jesus' family now, we would call them refugees. So
Right.
we moved from one state or nation state to another. But then we can also look, I believe, at Jesus' life as an adult when he was ministering. And he said that he was someone without a home. We might call him an itinerant rabbi or pastor or minister, but he was someone who was on the move during his adult life as well within his own country. And so I think now, if we think about migrant as someone who is on the move, even though that's a broad definition, I think it really is a humanizing definition, because many of us, even if it's not us personally, we have people there out there who were born and raised in their hometown and always live there, and they'll retire there and they'll pass away there. But the story of migration, when we think about people who have moved even in and out of our lives, it affects all of us. And I think that's a good place to start.
I really love that. And what I love about the study is it's putting migration into, number one, like almost a more neutral terms, like a way that anyone can respond to and anyone can connect with, I think, which is totally true. Like anyone who has had the experience of moving. Now, there might be a few people, right? My guess is a very small percentage within our listenership or that are out there that haven't moved ever, right? But anyone who's moved, they've moved schools, they've moved, you know, from one state to the other. That migration is tough. And if what's interesting is like, so my wife and I moved from Ohio to Virginia to not basically, we started a church. And when we did that move, we left friends, family, all sorts of people at this place. Now, we could still connect with everyone, right, with technology, but even in that, the migration, the movement is so hard. And imagining moving from where I'm at to a completely different country, like a missionary would do, but then imagining not being able to, like modern missionaries, oftentimes, at least from America, they go there, they have fully funded budgets, right? They're going there, they have visas, they have whatever, right? They're going there legally. They have fully funded budgets. They have American citizenship, all this stuff, right? For American, like missionaries, which is the context that I know of. Like all the missionaries I basically know are at least born here, right? They spent substantial time here first. And so the difficulty of that, and then imagining doing that with no support or very little support, it being illegal or being like not having my stuff, not having money. I mean, the idea is just heart-wrenching. And we look at it, and I think there can be a lot of fear and discomfort, feelings of discomfort when thinking about the idea of migration in general, because it signals change. It signals probably suffering and many people, negative experiences. How does the book try to bring, and I'm not saying you're hitting these specific feelings that I'm talking about, but how does the book try to bring a positive light to migration and migrants?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The main premise of the book is that God is a God of migrant people. So that
I think that's very
positive,
true.
right. I mean, that positive spin, because what you just named, everything that you just named is correct. This is an incredibly difficult situation. When I was a kid, our family moved from southern Oklahoma to northern Indiana, and it was a culture shock. It was,
Yes.
you know, you were from Ohio, so I'd never even been to the Midwest.
Well,
We
I was
left.
actually from Virginia and then moved to
Oh,
Ohio,
okay.
and that itself was enough
Yes,
of a culture shock. And
it
then,
is.
yeah.
It's wild, right? And, we left behind all of our family. We knew it was the four of us. That's all we knew. And that was a move made by choice. And it was a temporary one at that. And it was still just wildly difficult. It was also exciting. And there were lots of great things that happened with that. But it was very, very difficult. And so what you just named, everything is true. I did an exercise with an organization, a local organization here called Houston Welcomes Refugees. And when they take volunteers on, they give us a very simple but very powerful exercise to do, where we basically draw a bingo card. And they tell us, to put certain words in these bingo cards that are representative of things that are meaningful to us, whether it's our roles in life, wife, mother, student, whether it's our relatives, my spouse, one of my kids, we didn't have space for every one of them. Physical things that are valuable to us, things about our home that are valuable to us. And then one by one, they ask us, they give us certain prompts and say, mark this off, mark this off, mark this off. And, to help us just emotionally have a tiny, tiny crumb of an empathetic understanding of what it might be in their context, of course, to minister to refugees. What does this feel like? But the positive spin on that, I think, is that God names God's self as someone who is compassionate, close to the brokenhearted, who is always near, who is always present. So whether it's God calling Abram to migrate, go to a place that your fathers have not known, whether it's God being present with Naomi and her family moving because of famine, and then Ruth moving back because of loyalty and faithfulness, whether it's David running in the desert, afraid for his life from Saul, God presents God's self as someone who is intentionally close to people who are on the move. And I think that is something that, if we say we know that we are precious to God, I think this is one of those situations where we say the migrant, the person who is on the move, the group of people who are on the move, the Israelites, that's one of the most obvious stories. God was there, pillar of cloud by day, pillar fire by night, just maintaining God's presence over and over in the midst of all of that hardship.
Yeah, that's really a beautiful picture of God. This idea that the migration threads the whole biblical story, the whole narrative, the whole story of humanity. And it's like migration isn't a problem to be solved, right? It's almost like it's not a problem to be solved, but it's actually a way that God forms his people. And so I would love for you to go into more about how God uses like migrants and the migrant and migration thread. What aspects of that help form us, anyone as Christians, as we're looking to God to for this kind of help, and how is weaved through this whole story that you have, or the whole Bible study rather.
Yeah, I think this feels a bit of a roundabout way of answering that, but I think it's relevant and it's important. So if we think about migration as something um, in a cultural context, in any of us who've gone on vacation to another country, or maybe some people have taken mission trips, or even you and I talking about moving just across our country, there are cultural differences that we notice. Some of them are intangible, some of them are more obvious, like food or language. But if we are to only stay in our own places, then we have a small cultural picture. And I believe that translates to a smaller picture of who God is and who the people of God are. So you're a pastor. We've both, I'm sure, looked at, I'm not a history buff, but if we think about Christianity as a global religion, as a historical religion, where would we be without our church foreparents? Where would we be without the writings? But also, where would we be without each other now, our brothers and sisters? Like I mentioned, my migration story to the US, my family it's generations old, but one of the wonderful things that I've experienced in my 15 years in Houston, and being in one of the most, actually, I think it's now the most international city in the country, is having a lot of friends who are immigrants to the US. I have friends who are immigrants from literally every continent in the world. I have Asian American friends who are
That's awesome.
immigrants. I have Central and South American friends who are immigrants, European friends who are immigrants, African friends who are immigrants. And many of them, most of them, are Christians. And their experiences, sitting at the table with them, raising our kids together, doing family things together, those expand my understanding of who God is. Not just God bringing them to a different place, or God being present with them in a different place, like we've already talked about, but also just how is Christianity celebrated? How is Christianity lived out? What does their faith journey look like at home and with their families and in their context and in their congregations? And that is so rich for me. And I think that's one of those places where now, I think that's one of the most obvious things to me, is that migration enriches our understanding of who God is and who each other are in the world.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the friends that I have several friends that are immigrants, and they've brought, or migrants, I guess. Which one are
We can say
we?
immigrants. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
They came to the country, and their perspectives, the way that they think, the way that they talk. I mean, and I don't mean like in any derogatory at all. I mean, just the way that they think through and use their language to describe things. And it's just different than me. And it's so nice to be able to connect to that and say, oh man, this is so much broader and so much wider, I think. And then I grew up thinking, and that kind of I naturally understand. And it brings such a fullness to my life. And I really mean that. And like, if you don't have friends that are immigrants, then you don't, it's hard to understand that. It's hard to get it. And it's very easy to make caricatures also of people if you don't really know them. Extremely easy. And I feel like that's a lot of what's happening even right now. I mean, the way that it's actually pretty heartbreaking to me, the way that immigrants are being portrayed right now by the American political system. It's heartbreaking. I don't have a solution to that. And that's not really what I'm getting at. But I know that one thing is that people on an individual level, they might not be able to change the macro level of what's happening with the government, but they can change their own homes, right? They can be intentional about themselves, and they can bring that into the organizations, the workplaces, and all that they have. And if they're leaders in something like that, then they can actually have a chance to have more change and to bring change and bring a new perspective. And it makes me think about the way that people misunderstand the plight of the immigrant, plight of the migrant, that they misunderstand what's going on. There's a lot of myths, I think, surrounding this. This is one of the main themes in your book or in the Bible study. What are some of these myths, and maybe the big myth, and then some of these other myths that are surrounding the migrant topic and issue, and how are those addressed in the Bible study?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. A part of how the Bible study is laid out is we've got 4 path point statements that were provided by Made for PACs in this series. And the last one is what we've just been talking about. Migration promotes human flourishing. And so if we just keep that there and say, this is kind of not the exact opposite, but the myth named here is that migration is a problem. And so if we choose to look at this not in terms of it being a problem, but in terms of what we were just talking about, it enriches each of us. Migration actually promotes human flourishing. God is the God of the migrant. Then how might that be different? One of the things that the Bible study does really well is it incorporates a lot of personal stories and also essays from experts in migration, and it lays out some of the political things that were true when we were working on this study and are even kind of more true now in our current political system. One of the things that isn't in the study, but it's one of my favorite phrases that helps me understand what's going on in our system right now. I think that it helps us understand, especially U.S. migration, because that's where we live. That's what our context is. That's our political system that we're talking about. And if we think about what migration is, just a natural part of humanity, and then the way that it's not just portrayed, but how we are, what the policies are that exist that determine who is able to immigrate and who isn't. A professor of mine at Fuller, I took a wonderful class with her when I was doing my MDiv, and I've heard her say this phrase in public a few times, and it's really helpful. She is an expert. She's an advocate on migration policy, and she says of the current system that it is effective, illogical, and inhumane. And so I think if we think about those 3 things, it's ineffective, it's illogical, and it's inhumane. If I can tell maybe just a personal little
Please.
anecdote here, when I was in youth group in my Southern Baptist church in not quite rural Southern Oklahoma growing up, that was one of the places where I heard the phrase the most, they should just go home. Now, this is in the 90s. Of course, I took this very personally. As I mentioned, I'm half Hispanic. My family's Mexican American. And this was directed toward me, toward my family, toward my neighbors, toward my peers and loved ones. And it was, they should just go home. What was often accompanied by that is they, we love the they should just come here the legal way. If we take it one step further, sometimes it's they should just go home. They should come here the legal way, like my family did. Okay, we can't get into all of the immigration history in the U.S., but what we do know, and it's outlined in the book, for example, a wonderful section by my co-author, Dorcas Cheng Tosin, on the Chinese Exclusion Act. We can talk about how this immigration was race-based and quotas were put on until 1965. We can talk about how the legal pathways have changed since 4 or 5 generations ago when many white Americans who were then white Europeans were immigrating into the country. We can talk about how one of the books I read for class talks about literally uses the phrase that the United States wants to have its cake and eat it too when it comes to Mexican migrants who come here for work. And we can talk about how there just aren't the legal pathways now for citizenship and for immigration that there were, and that when legislation is introduced to create those policies, that it ends up getting shot down politically over and over and over again. And so it's just one of those situations where I should have said at the beginning of this podcast, I am no expert in migration, immigration, emigration by far, but I am a Christian trying to think well about these things, trying to act well about these things, and these myths that surround our current immigration policies are kind of like they're, everyone who comes into the country is breaking the law. There are criminals, all of this stuff. It just really statistically isn't true.
Absolutely.
And how our government has chosen, especially right now, to treat immigrants is not just despicable; it's cruel and it's evil. And as Christians, we should oppose those kinds of actions and trade them in for welcome and compassion and presence, as we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. That God is with the migrant, and how can we be with the migrant as well?
Yeah, I really appreciate that. I just want to, if I could, just for a moment, just kind of speak on that because it got me thinking. I'm working through a book with some guys from my church, and the first part of the book basically talks about moral foundations theory. So Jonathan Haidt is a guy, is a sociologist, I think, psychologist. I'm probably getting that wrong, but essentially he wrote. It's probably more psychologist actually, but he wrote all sorts of books. He's written The Happiness Hypothesis, The Anxious Generation, I think is one of his latest, but this one was A Righteous Mind: Why People Disagree on Politics and Religion. And so he has a specific theory that he's kind of championed called moral foundations theory. It's that we all have like these like moral taste buds, so to speak, that some things upset us more than others. And anyway, I won't get into all that, but the idea that we have the big famous thing, one of these metaphors, is that we have the rider and the elephant. And the elephant is like that part of us that is the intuition that kind of is going and doing what it wants. And most times the rider is either rubber stamping the intuition or it's basically trying to get this elephant. But if the elephant wants to go somewhere, the elephant's going to go there. And just thinking about this particular issue, because you said something that sparked this kind of imagination in my mind, this imaginative exercise of thinking like, people that are saying, yeah, they should go back or whatever, and how you like drew that out. I thought that was great because we oftentimes, most of the time, it's just intuition. We hear something and someone hears something and they don't even know why they don't like the migrant. Let's say it's we're talking about immigrants. Someone says, all these people coming in from South America or whatever, they just go back. Why can't they go back to their country? Which number one, just kind of is an expression of a lot of ignorance and I don't mean I'm not trying to be mean with that. It's just flat out like, it's an intuition that's like, number one, they don't even know what country probably they're talking about. They don't know the situation in that country. They don't know like all these different things you said, like going into history, looking at how migration has taken place, looking at how the laws have changed, looking at how things have become more difficult or things were exclusionary before and opened up and then resealed. And I mean, all this stuff, right? There's so much stuff that we're ignorant of. And yet we're going to speak on intuition. we're going to talk about it within like intuitively. And then we're going to try to say that we're right. That's what like our writer's doing, trying to justify our views post facto, after the case, right? Or however you say that, like just trying to justify our views. And I feel like that happens, what happens all the time in general. And so I'm quite certain it happens all the time with this issue. And there's an enormous amount of I think around this issue, including myself. Like again, I'm probably speaking most of the time from intuition as well. And I'm starting to build the case in my own mind and through conversations like this, through books like this, through people that have come on and they've essentially banned like these myths, the myth of like all these criminals and all, and how it takes all our jobs or all the things. And like people have come on and systematically dismantled those things. And so I've listened to that and I'm like, it makes me think. But my guess is that, I don't know, I'm going to throw this out there again. And 90% of people that have an issue with immigration have never looked into the issues in immigration, or have never tested the myths that they hear. And so I just would love you to speak on that. If you have thoughts on that, like how much of this is we're dealing with the elephant instead of the writer, and how do we get in touch with that writer? Do you think, have you had any success stories? Like, things like that, because it's rampant. Just the intuition that's, this is bad. We don't know why, it just is. How have you dealt with that? And how have you worked through that?
Yeah, I had never heard that before, the elephant and the rider, but that word picture for me, I could feel my body trying to steer my elephant as you were talking.
Dude, you'll never forget it. It's
Good
a
luck,
great
right?
metaphor.
Yeah,
it's
it's not happening. I have a mastiff sleeping behind me. We talked about our dogs earlier, and I have a big dog, and I'm like, sometimes it's difficult to get her, and she is nowhere near an elephant. I don't ride her, but even with the leash, so it's tough. It's tough to get our own intuition. I would say the thing that came to my mind when you were talking about it, and this is not directly addressed in the Bible study, but I imagine that your listeners from looking at your catalog would probably be familiar with this. It's helpful because the question that kept coming to my mind is where does that intuition come from? And I think, gosh, the answer to that is like so many places, right? Millions of places probably. But I think the one collectively, I would say maybe for the U.S. church, I think that intuition often comes from the same places that white Christian nationalism comes from. I think it comes from this place where those values that Christian nationalism preach also preach immigrant value system as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, that's what came to mind initially. And I think that is where, when I'm kind of talking to think here, so forgive me, I hope everything comes out
Please
okay.
Think out loud. It's all good. It makes sense.
But I'm thinking about how, for example, white Christian nationalism has Christian right there at the center. And so in a lot of ways, at least contexts where I've been a part of, if we can label something as Christian, then it kind of trumps all of these other arguments. So if I'm coming from a framework of Christian nationalism where the U.S. is the new promised land, or the U.S. Is a place where we understand that there's something about this nation that was chosen by God, or we have values built in from our founders that are biblical values, or whatever those historical myths are that promote Christian nationalism, then that becomes the thing. That becomes the standard. And so if I try and not necessarily negate that, though I think Christian nationalism does need to be negated, but if I try and come at those values with something that sounds more social, for example, of these people don't have anywhere to go, or isn't the U.S. supposed to be a safe haven? Look at the Statue of Liberty. Well, if I start to come at those things with things that are just kind of like common sense, compassion, social values. We should care about one another as people. I think that the Christian nationalism part of it that says we are the ones who kind of quote belong here and we get to make the rules about who enters and who stays and who doesn't belong here because it's somehow connected to the fact that we're a Christian nation. Any of those things that Christian nationalism promotes might just stomp on any of these other things. I think that's one place where this Bible study can just offer a little bit to say that this is social. The greatest commandment is love God and love your neighbor. And so we cannot dispute that as Christians. And also, it's not about trying to build some Jenga stack where one is higher than the other. This, I want to trump the values of Christian nationalism or something. It's saying we're having a conversation in a Christian context, then let's talk. Let's talk about what Christian values have to say about loving our neighbor, about caring for the stranger, about caring for the immigrant among us. I love how so many commands in the Torah given by God are given to the Israelites with the tagline of remember you once were. Remember you once were strangers in the land. Remember how you were persecuted. Remember how you were enslaved. Remember these things about your own past. And let that teach you how you are to treat the people among you who come to you, who don't look like you, who don't worship your same God, who don't speak your language or eat the foods you eat or look like your children, because you were once those people in Egypt, remember? And remember what I did for you, God says. And God says, God did that out of love and compassion and care and by choice. God didn't have some sort of obligation, I believe. Theologically, God tells us that God's choice was to care for Israel and to bring us in as adopted children, as Ephesians says. And so what can we do in that context? And it's not about trumping these things, but to say, what are these values, these God-given values and the God-given example of how we treat the ones who are strangers? Because if we believe we are the legacy of the biblical stories, whether it's the Israelites or Ruth or David or Jesus or Paul, then we have to believe our legacy is one of people who once were strangers, foreigners, travelers, and we have a responsibility, I might say a sacred responsibility, to treat others who are traveling, foreigners who have those situations, to treat them with the same love and compassion that we and our faith ancestors have been treated.
I mean, I really love that because, it's totally true. One of the metaphors, main metaphors used is this idea of a sojourner, someone who is traveling, someone who is here temporarily. And, this isn't our homeland, so to speak, as Christians. We have citizenship here, but we have higher citizenship that trumps that in heaven. And that higher citizenship, then, for Christians, we share that with that higher citizenship. We're supposed to, I think, in my understanding of what the scriptures say, is that we're supposed to be sharing that citizenship with that's a more important citizenship that we're sharing with our global church family. Essentially, they're our brothers and sisters in Christ, and they're the ones who we hold a citizenship, a heavenly citizenship that supersedes our earthly citizenship. And yet it seems like what Christian nationalism does is it actually reverses that. It actually says our earthly citizenship is more important than our heavenly citizenship. And really, our earthly citizenship is tantamount. It's equal to our heavenly citizenship. And that is just so not true. I can't find, I don't understand the logic there, the hermeneutical logic at least. But you mentioned something about values and virtues. And I would love for you, one thing that you guys do in the Bible study is you bring out some of the ways that we learn from the migrant and some of the virtues that are cultivated through and in the migrant. And I would love for you to talk about some of those virtues. I think you said faith, courage, and hope. I think were three of them. I don't know if there's more that you would bring out, But how are those virtues cultivated? By looking at and understanding the story, the plight, and the narrative of the migrant.
I think one of my favorite stories that we bring out in the book, one of the, as I mentioned, there's so many personal stories in the book. One of the things we also have is biblical stories. And as I've been looking at this study more and more, I've been thinking more and more about the story of Ruth. And it was even just this morning when I was prepping to speak with you, and I wrote Ruth's name on my notes, and then I underlined Naomi's name because we're talking about migration. And we look and see, I always think about Ruth in that story, which is not a bad thing. Ruth is a migrant in that story. But Ruth becomes a migrant because Naomi was a migrant first.
Yes.
And Naomi left Israel because of famine. It was hardship. Sometimes in some of the things that I've learned about migration is they talk about push and pull factors of migration. Some people are maybe pulled into another nation by maybe work or family or something like that. And sometimes there are push factors like violence or famine in Naomi's case that might cause them to leave a place that they wouldn't otherwise ever want to leave. And this was the case for Naomi and her family. And they left and they found new lives. Her children married. And then Naomi experienced hardship again. Her sons died. Her husband died in a land that wasn't her own. And when conditions improved in Israel, she went back. And Ruth decided to go with her. Her other daughter-in-law, no shade, she decided to stay. No doubt her family was there, and she kind of said, I'll write. And Naomi tried to get Ruth to do the same thing, and she didn't. And Ruth went with her. And I think even just in that short little snapshot, we see courage in Naomi and her family. We see perseverance. We see hardship. We see sadness, obviously. We see grief and loss at what their homeland had become, at least in that season of famine. And we see survival, where they went to a place. But we also see a place where they went and they were welcomed, at least by some. Her sons married. They had families. They grew there. They established a home.
Yes.
And that is brave.
Yes.
That is brave, and that is also faithful. We might say to, the host country welcomed them. They were contributing members of their society there. And then when they made a choice, they went home, like so many of us would do and do when we're in those situations. And then Ruth chose loyalty to Naomi. And she experienced then loss of leaving her homeland and choosing to make a new life in another place. And Ruth and Naomi's story, I think for me, I often try to challenge myself and say, what if I thought of my immigrant neighbors, friends, peers? What if I thought about Ruth like them? What if I thought about them like Ruth? Really humanizing these stories. I think that's sometimes is the trick with some of these biblical stories is we've seen them so much for many of us, especially us Sunday school kids, we've seen them so much that we don't really think about what that really would have been like. We don't go back to the Houston Welcomes Refugees bingo card and say, oh my goodness, that really meant, Ruth left her parents if they were still alive, her siblings, her friends, her job, all of those things and moved. Naomi saw the place where she grew up become devastated by a lack of food and her her community around her. They may not have all had the opportunity to leave. And so no doubt some of them became sick and probably died. And, these things. And it's not that migration always is in hardship like that, but it does always include loss of some sort, even if it's an
Yes.
exciting move, even if it's exciting move for some sort of pull factor that is wonderful and will be amazing. I have lots of immigrant friends, as I mentioned, who have come here for job or family or school or work, any of these things, exciting, choices that they made to come and still left family, left their country. They all experience some sort of loss of some sort. And I think if we approached our relationships like that, maybe a good first step, maybe.
I mean, I think that's a really excellent point. And, just this simple act of starting to imagine, using our imagination, right, to allow ourselves to enter into these stories. We can do that. We have the ability. And what's amazing is that once we do that, our body produces the same, similar feelings, although obviously they're not the same intensity and everything as someone who's actually in the moment. But we can experience similar feelings that help us, to be able to empathize and be able to understand and start to imagine, man, that would be really difficult. And then what does that do? That makes us more sensitive, that makes us more gracious, that makes us more understanding, and that allows us to not just get rid of nuance and see everything in black and white and make labels and categorize people without understanding their individual nature and their environments that they've come from. Just like we would want someone to treat us, right? It's like it then comes back to treat others as you'd want to be treated. And if you're in that similar situation, you would want someone who wouldn't just assume you're a criminal because you came from another country or because you came from another country illegally. Like you would want someone to assume, not really to make as little assumptions as possible, I guess, except for just like, hey, they must have been in a difficult situation or something had driven them from their country. Imagine what would drive you from the place that you grew up and loved and knew and the familiar and the comfortable. Well, it had to be something big, something where you
Exactly
didn't
right.
feel like your survival was at stake, or like you said, like that probably would be that push factor, but then the pull would be like, or there's something that you needed to do it because you just didn't have the same opportunities here and wherever you were, it wasn't going to work. Something was creating that. And that idea of the motion and the going around and spreading out, it's one of the things that you bring out in the book. And I'd love just kind of like for the last major question, like talk to us about the idea of motion as an embodiment of peace, an embodiment of God. Even I think you use Matthew 4:12-25. You kind of show this idea of Jesus, who is a migrant, migrating from Nazareth to Capernaum. He's recruiting fishermen. He's, it's migration is all over this story, and all over this. So I'd love for you to just take a couple moments and just think out loud or whatever your thoughts are on the idea that of emotion, that migration really promotes human flourishing. Really, right? By moving us around. I'd love for you to speak on that for a little bit.
Yeah, it will be kind of thinking out loud. Thanks for the question. Thanks for pointing out again Jesus' migration as a grown man and as a pastor. I think one of the probably a few things come to mind. One thing is for Jesus, he didn't have what we have right now. He didn't have a podcast where he could put something on YouTube. And so his motion and his migration allowed him to touch more people, like to physically touch more people, to bring healing, to minister God's love to more people. And he was still very limited in what he could do, a small geographical region. And even so, he chose to travel by foot. And I think that shows us, I think this God being a migrant God, I think that shows us just one physical example of God doing that. I think that we talk about motion. I think about, again, the story of the Israelites. And I just continually think about God being present with us. When we look at some other religions ancient Near East religions where there were temples and there were places where God was and people came to their gods. And our God shows us over and over again in the scriptures, but particularly through Israel's migration, that God is a God who migrates with God's people. God is in motion with God's people, moving among us, leading us, going in front of us, going behind us. And if we think this was true for the Israelites, it's true for us as U.S. Christians. It is definitely true of Christians all over the world who migrate. That's one of the things that we didn't touch on, but it's something that migration experts, especially Christian migration experts, often bring up, is how many Christians are migrating to the U.S. because of persecution or other reasons. And right now we do have a political situation in our country where the administration is not favorable to those migrants either, but they're in motion. And I think that that's probably the thing that keeps coming to my mind, is that God is not stagnant. God is not still. God is a migrant God. God is a God of the migrant, and that motion is a way, I don't know, to kind of stir the pot in a good way, right? We're moving about, we're mingling transnationally, we're getting to know one another, then that means we're getting to know other parts of God. How does God show up in Israel or Spain or Gaza or Mexico or Ghana or Australia or Canada? Well, it's the same God, but the needs are different, the contexts are different, the language is different. That's one of the things that I love when I will use the word studied loosely in seminary. When I made it through my language classes, I was just so amazed at how many of those, this Greek word where it's hard to translate, there isn't
Yes.
exactly an English word for this, or this Hebrew, even the tenses of verbs don't even really have a tense of verb, that is, it's like, gosh, but God communicates, to people even in their own languages. And when we can move
Yes.
about and experience those with one another, man, we are just so much richer because of it. I'm kind of picturing in my head like just people not scurrying about, but just kind of with no real pattern, just kind of organically moving about, and just thinking just how wonderful and lovely that is, that we get to experience one another in that way through that sacred motion.
Yeah, I think that's really well said, and I appreciate that. And just the idea, right, that, you think even about how the early church began to spread at all, and it was through migration, right? It was through people that essentially were forced out of Jerusalem through persecution, and they went and it spread. And then, of course, it spread through the Apostle Paul and his intentionality, where he was going and starting these churches. But you see God using this consistently through, so much so, we fight over all these things that are just kind of not clear in the Bible. And it seems like you look at this theme and it's all over the place, and yet we don't even think about it. It's like one of those things that's hiding in plain sight. And I just think it's great that you guys have tried to bring this to light again, to think about it. It came out at the right time. We need this Bible study right now in the church. I think especially white Christians being one, we need this Bible study. And I would love for you, this is the last question, what kind of stories would you want to hear that tell you, or maybe that you've already heard, that tell you that this book is accomplishing your purpose for it, or the purpose that was given to it?
Yeah. Say that again. Say that again, Josh. You can cut
No
this or you can
worries.
keep it.
So essentially, how will you know that this book
Yeah.
is accomplishing its
Yeah.
purpose?
Yeah. No, that's great. I think that you're right. I, in my head, kind of have two groups. When this study was released, and it is so beautiful, and I'm so thrilled with it, I kind of had two groups in mind. One of them is exactly who you named. It is white Christians. This book, this Bible study, is one that I believe it is thoughtful, it is nuanced, it is personal, has so much scripture inside of it, and so much real on the ground information about migration, from people's migration stories to historical policies in the U.S. I just think it is a wonderful resource for white Christians. The other group I had in mind when I saw it come out, as I mentioned, my relationships with people, I really was hopeful that my immigrant friends would be honored by this Bible study. That when I was in social work way back in the day, we used to use the phrase that's pretty common now. It was new to me 20 years ago, but nothing about us without us. And so this Bible study is one of those that I would say, I hope it wouldn't just be a resource for white Christians to use. That would be helpful. I do hope that. But I also hope that my immigrant friends, people with migration stories that are very close to them, whether it's them or their family or their close friends, I hope that they would be honored by what they read and hear. It's also an interactive study, so I could mention that there are, QR codes and people sharing their stories and their poems, spoken word, videos in their own voices, and artwork that just fills the pages with people expressing how their migration journeys have impacted themselves and their families and their communities. And so I really hope that that they would be honored by it too. And I think this Bible study accomplishes that both and to kind of culminate in what we've been talking about, that migration is a part of human flourishing. And whether we are the migrant or whether we are people who are in relationships with people who are migrants, migration is helping all of our flourishing. And so asking the questions, how can we support that good work of migration, whether it's us or our neighbors?
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Alexis. How can people get the book? I mean, is there a preferred vendor, really?
Well,
And what else do you have going on? How can they connect with you?
yeah, sure. Thanks. It is available on InterVarsity Press's website. It is also on Amazon. It's pretty easy to order there. In both of those places, you can see the other Bible studies that are coming out as a part of this series between Made for Pax and InterVarsity Press, and so they can get it any of those places. And people can connect with me. Probably the easiest way is through my podcast, which is called That Makes Total Sense. I also just wanted to mention that if people had other questions or looking for resources, I did a quick thing this morning. I went to my website, thatmakestotalsense.com, and just did a quick search on immigration. And that brought up all of the episodes that I have done on immigration, specifically each one of them with an author who has a book on it.
Nice.
They are the experts. They are the ones. And so people can find all sorts of additional resources there with wonderful authors who know a lot more than me talking about this really important issue.
Well, that's great. Well, Alexis, thanks so much for coming on the show, spending some time with us, giving us your insight. It was really a pleasure.
Thanks so much, Josh, for having me.
Absolutely. And to our viewers and our listeners, guys, thanks for joining for another episode of Faithful Politics Podcast. Make sure you're tuning in again. Obviously, we get our stuff out 2 times a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays. So be tuning in. Make sure you're downloading. Make sure you're liking, subscribing, again, doing all that good stuff that helps us out, because it really does. And guys, until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. Thanks and God bless.